I don't think the Sega Game Gear needs much of an introduction. It was a handheld console in the early 90s, and it was colour. And it being colour meant that it was coveted back then. Had a few issues though, battery life being one of them, and you know what, there were some issues with the build quality as well, particularly around the capacitors that were used in these things. And anyway, I've done a fair few of these on this channel. As you can see right here, we've got this Sega Game Gear that was sent to me by a customer, RWL 2012, and as we can see, it's switched on, but we can't see anything on the screen, and we can't really hear anything. But if you tilt like this, we get the Sega logo, and we can see the games running, but the screen is extremely dim. Now, this is a very, very common problem with these Sega Game Gears, and it's caused by the electrolytic capacitors within the Game Gears. When they work like this, and they're just extremely dim and have barely audible or no audio, it's almost certainly down to the electrolytic capacitors, and the trick is to just remove those capacitors and replace them, because Sega didn't use the best capacitors on these, and I've done many of these on the channel now, and yeah, this is just yet another one that we're going to do on behalf of a customer. And with this one we have a slightly different format, because we're also going to be installing an LED backlight mod, which you can see on the left there, and it's a reasonably interesting little addition. Now, most people would go ahead and just replace the entire LCD with something a bit more modern that gives you a clearer display, because the original displays, they're kind of faded, they don't have the best refresh rates and so on. However, what they do have is very, very good battery life. Now, you may think, well, hang on a minute, the Sega Game Gear, it's a battery hog. You know, you put your batteries in there, you switch it on, and, you know, 3 or 4 hours later, you've got a dead Game Gear. There's just no power. So what gives? What are you talking about, New Retro Repair? What do you mean you can get better battery life out of the original display? Now, to explain why the Sega Game Gear had such a high power draw and used so much energy, it was essentially down to the compact fluorescent tube. Those tubes wasted a lot of energy in the form of heat, and not to mention they were a high voltage technology, and yeah, the amount of energy they require to provide the backlight to the screen is actually quite high. And since then we've had the invention of light emitting diodes. So, you know, back when the Game Gear was made, LCD tech was very commonly backlit by your much older fashioned style lighting sources, because light emitting diodes weren't really a common consumer product at that time. So yeah, what we're going to do in this video is remove all the old capacitors, replace them. This is a pretty standard procedure with any Game Gear that's not really functioning correctly anymore. And probably 9 times out of 10 that's enough to get them going. This one is actually an extremely good example of a Game Gear that simply needs a recap. It's fully operational, it's just degraded in its performance. So that's a telltale giveaway that all we need to do is replace the capacitors on the system. So, you know, it's a usual affair. Crack it open, remove the boards, and work on it. So we can see here we've got these two halves. We've got the half of the audio board and the power board, and we've got this part here, which is the main board. So, as usual, it's just a case of open it up and remove all the screws and so on and get the boards out. Now, a little trick I like to do with the Sega Game Gear, whenever I'm working on these, if you're taking the main motherboard out of its plastic shell, if I'm replacing the LCD screen plastic cover with a glass one like this one, what I'll do is I'll remove the protective cover from the glass and just rewrap it with the bubble wrap and put it aside. And you can use that protective film that was protecting the new screen cover on the original LCD display And the reason that I do this is because those displays are so incredibly easy to scratch. It is unbelievably easy to scratch them, and this will help prevent that when working on the device. So this is stuck quite hard. When this happens, it's usually a good idea to take some hot air from a hot air gun on a fairly low setting, like 100 to 150 degrees Celsius, and just heat these adhesive plastic protector things up until the adhesive melts a little bit, and then it's much easier to remove these. And that's the way I've been doing this for a little while now. So yeah, we just get this nice and hot, but not too hot to melt the plastic, and then it should just pull right off. There we go, we can see it's taking a little bit of brute force, but it's coming. And alley up. So next up, time to desolder the capacitors on the power board, and we can do this with a desoldering gun, with a desoldering pump, or even desoldering braid. I'm using this this Hako desoldering gun to get it off. They just make the job infinitely easier and quicker, and it's much better than the cheaper desoldering gun I was using before, which I kind of retired because it failed. The heating core fell apart on that thing. But yeah, anyway. Standard desoldering affair, really. Next up is the audio board, and we know from the beginning of this video that this particular audio board is not really outputting any audio, even though the games are running, which also is indicative of an issue with the capacitors. So what we're going to do is desolder all of the electrolytics on this board too, and we're going to replace them. And in addition to that, what I'm going to do is remove all of the plastic connectors. And the reason I'm going to remove the plastic connectors, which I wouldn't normally do, is because it's very easy to graze them with a soldering iron. And although that won't impact the performance of the device in any way, I do know that the customer who's having this work done, he is very much a fan of keeping his consoles in the best possible condition. And even though you can't see these parts once the machine is back together, I'd rather give this back to him, you know, in the best possible condition that I can and as close to original as I can. I realise it's not quite going to look original with, you know, with replacement capacitors in there that don't look like they're from factory, but you know, I think it's good to try and sort of cater to different customers' needs like that, and I take great pains to do that as well. So that's what I'm doing here. You can see now I'm adding some leaded solder in, and the reason I'm adding the leaded solder in is just so that it's easier to desolder these components, because these components are through hole, and yeah, it should make life just that little bit easier. So yeah, I'm just going to put this leaded solder in now to reduce the melting temperature of the solder that's on there, and then I'm going to bring the Hakko desoldering gun in and get them removed. So without further ado, on to that. And now the reason that I have removed all of the plastic parts on this board will become very clear. It's because I'm going to use hot air like I'm doing here to remove these capacitors, and it means we can use the hot air to get them off without worrying about bashing the soldering iron into the audio jack or the little mounting sockets for the different cables that plug into it. And you can see it makes the job that much easier. Hot air soldering on these parts really makes the job just that much easier. And as we can see, you know, these are just coming right off, no problems. Fantastic. Exactly what we want. And it also makes the cleanup a lot easier with the soldering braid too, because you can get in at better angles. You know, you don't have to care about maneuvering around the plastic sockets. So yeah, great. And you can see these are just coming off super easy, which is great. Absolutely fantastic. I love it when these come off easily, and you can see as well there's not any major corrosion being left on the pads, which can be a real issue with Sega Game Gear audio boards. I've seen it a ton of times. Sometimes you have to remove all of the surface mount components just to clean up the damage that the leaked capacitors do to the pads and the surrounding resistors and so on. So as you can imagine, I'm very pleased that these caps just haven't leaked. It really is making this job much easier. I can tell that the owner of this has taken great care of it, even if it's not really been used much, and honestly, getting it repaired at this stage is absolutely ideal. You don't want to leave it any longer, because the longer you leave these, the more they can leak over time. And you can see these pads aren't perfectly clear. There's been a very minimal amount of corrosion, but it's nothing compared to what you often see on these. So time to solder these capacitors in. Now, it's always worth mentioning that you should try and use some reasonably high quality name brand capacitors for these kind of jobs. I recommend Panasonic, Nichicon, Rubicon. Any of the sort of well-known capacitors out there are usually a decent enough choice for this. You don't want to go sticking in a completely no-name brand capacitor and find that it leaks all over the board and causes a bunch of corrosive damage to the traces 2 years down the line, you know. These are old retro systems now, and they're getting harder and harder to find, and yeah, it's just worth being careful with how you treat them. And that's all I've really got to say on that. Just, you know, if you buy cheap, you buy twice. So unfortunately I didn't quite capture me removing the compact fluorescent tube to install this Retrokai LED backlight mod, but that doesn't really matter. But here's the mod, and all you do is slide it to where the compact fluorescent tube mounting thing was, and you just pop it in like this. And then you can see that there are screw holes on this, and you just screw it into the main PCB like so. Relatively easy process, straightforward, and there's not a lot to it. Once this is secured and the Game Gear has had its capacitors replaced on it, we'll go ahead and solder all the wires on and connect everything up as it needs to be. But yeah, as you can see, pretty straightforward process. And the other thing that I didn't quite capture on film was the removal of the high voltage components on the Game Gear. If you look just below my right hand that I'm screwing with, just where those contact pads are on that Retrokai board, right below that there was a high voltage transformer and some high voltage capacitors. All of those have been removed from the board, and they are now unpopulated as they're not needed anymore because they drive the old compact fluorescent tube, which obviously is being replaced with this adaptive backlight control unit. And I think this thing being called an adaptive backlight unit is a little misleading in my opinion, because if you hear adaptive backlight, you kind of immediately think of something like what a mobile phone does when sunlight hits it, where it'll increase the brightness of the display, or if it's darker it'll decrease the brightness of the display. In the case of this mod, that doesn't happen. It doesn't do that. Instead, it's just bound to either the brightness wheel, or you can do some hotkey presses, and those hotkey presses will change to preset brightness levels. So it's not really an adaptive backlight unit. It's actually, in my opinion, a little bit of a lie. But anyway, that is what it is, and it is a reasonably decent product nonetheless. But again, as I suggested earlier, personally, I would recommend getting a replacement LCD. But again, it's all down to your personal use case and what you want it for. If you just want extended battery life, go ahead and get this. So now we need to double check where we can get 5 volts from on this board. Now I'm pretty sure we can get it from the same trace that C68's positive is on. So let's just meter out where we are. Nope, didn't think so. Ah, there we go. So that's our 5 volt rail. So now we're going to need a ground. So it looks like we've found ground as well. Excellent. Fantastic. So we now know where we need to solder. So now we'll go ahead and we'll tin these pads with some solder in preparation for the wires that we'll solder onto the Game Gear's board itself. And we're just going to tap into those points that I metered out a few moments ago. So now we'll check our work and we'll just meter out this to make sure we've got ground on this chip. And we're looking good. And this just allows us to know that, that we've definitely wired it up correctly and that we can continue on with the modification. Very good. Yeah, I'm happy with this now. I think that's pretty good. So there we go, that's how you wire up the LED board. We've still got to do the buttons as well, wire those up, but we need to get the other capacitors on the board and so on as well for that to really be practical. So we'll get to that in a moment. So now let's go ahead and install all of the capacitors that this board needs, and hopefully this will be a nice successful mod. So let's crack on with getting these capacitors installed, and as you can see, I like to keep these nice and neat as well. So yeah, I trim the legs nicely, I make sure they sit flat with the board, and I try to do as good a job as I can. What some people do is they'll leave the legs with a lot of excess length on them, and that's actually pretty dangerous for the board. It's possible for those legs to short against things when you reassemble the console and so on. So if you are recapping a Game Gear yourself, maybe it's your first time or something, I recommend bending your capacitor legs to match how I've done here. You'll get a much better overall finish and install of the capacitors if you do it this way rather than sort of in an ad hoc messy way. So just bear that in mind if you're doing this yourself. Okay, so now we've managed to replace all of the capacitors on the board, so now we just need to wire up this start pad to the correct location on the Game Gear board, and we need to do the same for the button too. This pad seems a bit loose. This one seems fine. That start one, it's kind of hard to notice, but it wobbles around a bit when I put my iron on it. I don't think it's particularly well secured to the board. And coming up will be a small mishap with that pad. Easy enough to fix, but annoying to deal with. But anyway, onwards with the modification we go. There ain't no getting off this choo-choo train. So here we go, we'll just do the last of the soldering on this, and watch what happens now when I nudge this with my tweezers. I'm just tapping it lightly, and look at this. You see that move? You see that move? There we go. That pad has more or less lifted. It's still secure to the board, but that is really, really annoying. Look at that. See how it just sort of freeform moves around? This is going to be annoying to fix. It's fixable, and we shall continue on. But yeah, I'm not happy with leaving it like this for the customer. I need to do something about this. So if you ever find yourself in this situation, just scrape back the conformal coating that's on the PCB on the trace that leads to the pad. As you can see me doing here, this pad is still attached and I don't want to mess with it, so we just take this conformal coating back and leave plenty of it exposed. So we'll get this trace underneath the conformal coating exposed and make sure it's nice shiny copper, which as you can see it's looking pretty good now. Just get a little bit more of this conformal coating off. We'll be gentle because I don't want to completely remove the pad. Not that that's a big issue when you're soldering direct to a trace like this anyway. We'll just clean that off with some isopropyl alcohol, 99%. And there we go. That is now nice and clean. And the next thing we'll do is we'll tin up the trace. So we'll get a little bit of flux on it. And next thing, a bit of fresh solder. So we'll grab some leaded solder and we'll just solder that, tin that up nicely. There we go. And now we'll resolder that wire. And we'll just get it nice and flush and straight with the board. And there we go. That's perfect now. That should hold it nice and steady. So the next thing we'll do is we'll solder a wire to the left-hand side of C37, and then we will wire that to the appropriate pad on the Retrokai LED board. So we'll just go ahead and solder this cable to the side of this capacitor. It's just a bit fiddly. Just change my angle of attack. It's down there toward the bottom right, and now it's in the middle. There we go. And so we'll just go ahead and get that soldered in. There we go. And all we need to do is trim off the excess wire left. I'll get to that in a little bit though, and we'll bring that over to button 2. We'll get that soldered to that pad. So we'll just trim this wire, and then we'll strip off some of the insulation, solder it directly to button 2, and then we should be looking good. So we'll just snip. There we go. And now strip the wire. Which you can see me fumbling around with. There we go. So we'll just pop that in the stripper and pop that off, and there we go. We now have some nice copper exposed, and we can solder straight to button 2. Now this board is not the best considering the other pad lifted, so I'm going to try to be as fast as I can. I'm not actually running my soldering iron all that hot either. It's about 380C, which shouldn't cause a pad to lift, but apparently it can. So let's just try this again and be as quick as we can about it. Let's just move that cable up a bit, and there we go. That's looking... that's okay. I think I'm happy with that now. And let's just start cleaning up some of the mess. So what we'll do now is replace the missing conformal coating, and I'm going to use some liquid wire. It's not conformal coating or UV mask, but it is very similar, and it is the same colour too, so it should match the board a little better than my typical UV green solder mask, and it will do exactly the same as it's meant as liquid wire insulator. So there we go, we just smear that on. I'll clean up some of the excess around, and there we go. That's already starting to look a little better, and then we just want to try this out, and we can do that with a bit of hot air, and so I'll get to it. Unfortunately, I didn't hit record when reassembling the console, so unfortunately you're not going to get to see the Game Gear being reassembled, or fortunately, depending on your view. So anyway, I'd just like to take this moment to thank Ro for providing some footage of the finished console back with its rightful owner, and you know what, it's always great to see a device being used by a customer, so thanks a lot, Ro, for donating this footage for this video, and I hope you enjoy it. So I just want to comment here and just say, apparently it sounds much better in real life. Personally, my ears aren't really attuned to hear the difference between a before and after, so, you know, it's one of those things. But anyway, I just want to say extra special thanks to Ro for grabbing this footage for me and indulging me, and yeah. I hope you enjoy the console, I hope you enjoy the video, and as always, das Vidania.